The morning sun of June 1942 reflects off the polished mahogany tables of the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Officers move with a stiff, rhythmic precision, their white gloves snapping against their sides as they carry folders that they believe contain news of a crushing victory at Midway. The air is stagnant, heavy with the scent of green tea and the unshakable arrogance of a navy that has not known defeat for half a century. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sits in his cabin aboard the battleship Yamato, hundreds of miles from the smoke of battle. He stares at a go board, his fingers hovering over a black stone, but his mind is tracking the invisible flight paths of the Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu. The silence in the room is absolute, broken only by the distant rhythmic vibration of the ship's massive engines. A young radio operator in a cramped, sweltering communications room suddenly stiffens, his headset pressing against his ears. He scribbles frantically onto a notepad, his breath hitching as the coded fragments of Kaga and fire begin to coalesce into a nightmare. His hand trembles so violently that the pencil lead snaps, leaving a jagged black mark across the page. The first flash of the catastrophe reaches the high-ranking staff officers through a series of vague, panicked transmissions. They stand huddled around a massive map of the Pacific, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of overhead lamps. Confusion reigns as they try to reconcile their expectations of triumph with the terrifying reality of uninterrupted enemy dive bomber attacks. Back on the Yamato, the chief of staff enters Yamamoto's cabin, holding a single slip of paper. He does not speak. He simply bows low, his shadow stretching long and thin across the floor mats. Yamamoto looks up, the stone finally dropping from his hand and clattering across the wooden board, signaling a game, and an empire, suddenly lost. In the bowels of the Naval Ministry, the hum of teletype machines becomes a frantic mechanical scream. Clerks who were preparing victory leaflets now stare at the rolling paper in stunned silence, realizing the heart of the Imperial Navy has been torn out in a single morning. The pride that had been building since Pearl Harbor evaporates, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. Admiral Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, receives the news in his austere office. He stares out the window at the peaceful Tokyo skyline, his expression remaining a mask of stone even as his heart hammers against his ribs. He realizes that the decisive battle has occurred, but the decision has gone to the enemy, leaving Japan's flank wide open. The scene shifts to the dark corridors of the Imperial Palace, where news travels like a slow-acting poison. Footsteps echo against the lacquered wood as messengers carry the burden of the 4 lost carriers toward the inner sanctum. The weight of the secret is already beginning to crush the men tasked with holding it, as they realize the public can never know. A group of middle-ranking officers gathers in a smoke-filled briefing room, arguing over the initial reports. Some refuse to believe the American rabble could sink even one carrier, let alone the elite Kido Butai. Their denial is a desperate shield against the truth that their naval supremacy has vanished into the depths of the Pacific. In a hidden naval hospital, the first wounded survivors of the disaster are brought in under the cover of night. They are forbidden from speaking to their families, their existence now a state secret. The nurses move like ghosts, their eyes wide with the realization that the bandages they apply are covering the wounds of a dying empire. Yamamoto stands on the deck of the Yamato, looking out at the endless horizon where his carriers should have been. He thinks of the thousands of veteran pilots and sailors now resting on the ocean floor, their expertise irreplaceable. The wind whips his cloak, but he remains motionless, a monument to a strategic gamble that failed. High Command begins the grinding process of the Great Cover-Up. Orders are issued to destroy all documents related to the actual loss count and to substitute them with fabricated reports of victory. The ink flows thick and black, erasing the Akagi and Kaga from the official record as if they had never existed. Emperor Hirohito sits in his study, listening to the filtered report provided by the military. The officers omit the scale of the disaster, speaking only of heavy losses, while emphasizing damage inflicted on the enemy. The emperor's face remains unreadable, though he lingers on the maps of the Central Pacific longer than usual. In the naval shipyards, the pace of work becomes frantic and desperate. Workers are pushed to the breaking point to repair the few remaining vessels, unaware that the core of their protection is gone. The clanging of hammers against steel sounds like a funeral dirge for the ships that will never return to these docks. A veteran officer, a survivor of the Hiryu, sits in a darkened room at the naval base, staring at his empty hands. He can still feel the heat of the flames and the tilt of the flight deck as it slipped beneath the waves. He is ordered to remain in isolation, his trauma ignored in favor of maintaining the illusion of invincibility. The propaganda department prepares a radio broadcast for the Japanese public. The announcers practice their triumphant tones, weaving a narrative of a glorious victory at Midway. The disconnect between the lies being spoken and the truth being hidden creates a tension that permeates the entire building. Inside the war room, the massive wooden blocks representing the carriers are physically removed from the strategy table. The officers watch in silence as the 4 icons are placed in a drawer and locked away. The table looks hauntingly empty, a visual representation of the hole left in Japan's defensive perimeter. Admiral Yamaguchi's final moments are whispered about in the hallways of the ministry. The story of him choosing to go down with the Hiryu becomes a source of both inspiration and profound sorrow. The High Command uses his sacrifice to distract from their own tactical failures, turning a disaster into a myth of martyrdom. The tension between the Army and the Navy reaches a boiling point during a secret joint session. The Army generals sense something is wrong, mocking the Navy's vague reports. The Navy officers sit rigid, their teeth clenched, holding on to a secret that would give their rivals total political leverage. A junior staff officer is tasked with burning the original battle logs from the Midway operation. He watches the flames lick the edges of the paper, the names of the sunk ships turning to gray ash. He feels as though he is participating in a funeral for the truth itself. Yamamoto sends a personal message of apology to the families of the high-ranking officers lost. But even these letters are coded and ambiguous. He sits at his desk, the brush moving slowly across the parchment, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he led these men to their doom. At the Naval War College, instructors continue to teach the doctrine of the unbeatable carrier strike, even as they know the strike force no longer exists. The students look on with patriotic fervor, completely unaware that the tactics they are learning are now obsolete and unsupported. News of the American industrial might begins to filter into the intelligence reports. The High Command realizes that while they have lost 4 carriers they cannot replace, the Americans are launching new ships every month. The math of the war begins to shift from glorious battle to a grim war of attrition. The mood in the officers' mess transitions from celebratory to somber. Men drink their sake in silence, avoiding eye contact. The rumors are spreading like a virus, whispers of a shameful defeat that no one dares to say out loud for fear of the military police. A map of the Pacific is laid out in Yamamoto's quarters, now showing a massive gap between Japan and Hawaii. He traces the route the Americans might take, realizing that the defensive bubble has been popped. The vulnerability is palpable, a cold wind blowing through the strategic plans of the empire. The Japanese public gathers around communal radios to hear the victory announcement. They cheer and wave flags, their joy a bitter irony to the officers watching from the windows of the Naval Ministry. The gap between the leaders and the led has never been wider. In the carrier hangars on the mainland, ground crews wait for planes that will never arrive. They polish the spare parts and check the fuel lines, looking at the clock and wondering why the victorious fleet has been delayed for so many days. The silence of the empty hangars is deafening. Admiral Nagano meets with the Prime Minister Tojo. The two men sit in a room decorated with traditional art, discussing the restructuring of the Pacific defense. The word Midway is never mentioned, but the shadow of the 4 carriers looms over every sentence they speak. Night falls over Tokyo and the blackouts begin. In the darkness, the High Command continues to work, their faces haggard under the dim blue lights. They are trying to find a way to win a war they now know is strategically lost, moving pieces on a board that no longer reflects reality. A survivor of the Soryu is interrogated by his own superiors, not for information about the enemy, but to ensure he hasn't told anyone the truth. He realizes he is more afraid of his own commanders than he was of the American pilots. The betrayal of his own service stings more than the salt water. The Navy issues a secret order to accelerate the conversion of passenger liners into makeshift carriers. The officers know these ships are death traps, but they are desperate for anything with a flight deck. The desperation is hidden behind a facade of innovative military expansion. Yamamoto receives a report on the American carrier Enterprise, which his pilots claim to have sunk multiple times. Seeing it still active in the intelligence photos is a psychological blow. He realizes the Americans are not just lucky, they are resilient and better informed. The ghosts of the Kido Butai seem to haunt the halls of the Naval Ministry. Every time a door slams or a voice is raised, men jump, their nerves frayed by the secret they are guarding. The collective guilt of the High Command starts to manifest as paranoia and internal finger-pointing. An intelligence officer discovers that the Americans had broken the Japanese naval codes. He brings the evidence to his superiors, but he is dismissed and told that Japanese codes are impenetrable. The refusal to face the truth about their security failure ensures that more disasters will follow. The scene shifts to a quiet Shinto shrine where a high-ranking official prays for the souls of the lost sailors. He rings the bell, the sound echoing through the trees, a lonely tribute to the thousands of men who were erased from history by a stroke of a pen. Yamamoto begins to plan a new offensive in the Solomon Islands, a desperate attempt to regain the initiative. He knows it's a long shot, but he cannot sit still while the Empire's strength bleeds away. His eyes are tired, his movements slower, the weight of the war visible in every gesture. A junior clerk accidentally sees the true casualty list, and is immediately reassigned to a remote island outpost. The efficiency of the suppression system is terrifying, ensuring that the bubble of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere remains unburst for the civilian population. The physical toll on the high command becomes evident. Men are collapsing from exhaustion and stress, their skin sallow, their eyes sunken. They are fighting a war on two fronts. One against the Allies and one against the truth within their own borders. A secret meeting is held in a bunker beneath the Naval Ministry. The officers discuss the final defense of the homeland. The loss of the carriers has brought the reality of an Allied invasion into their planning years earlier than. Yamamoto looks at a photograph of the Akagi during its commissioning. He remembers the pride he felt, the belief that Japan had created the ultimate weapon. Now, that ship is a twisted wreck of steel at the bottom of the sea, and he feels his own life is following the same trajectory. The first American air raids on small outposts are reported. Without carrier cover, these islands are sitting ducks. The High Command receives the frantic calls for air support and has to respond with, "support not available," a phrase that becomes a death sentence for thousands. The internal rivalry between the Navy's big gun battleship faction and the carrier faction turns ugly. The battleship advocates use the Midway disaster to claim that carriers were always a fad, further complicating Japan's naval strategy with outdated thinking. Yamamoto writes a final letter to a friend, hinting at his premonition of his own death. He knows the Americans will eventually target him just as they targeted his ships. He accepts this with a samurai stoicism, his only regret being the state of the Navy he loves. A propaganda film is released showing reconstructed footage of the Midway battle. It shows Japanese planes shotting down waves of Americans while the carriers remain untouched. The audience in the Tokyo theater cheers, while a naval officer in the back row weeps silently in the dark. The High Command orders the remaining veteran pilots to be spread out among new units as instructors. However, this dilutes the quality of the frontline forces even further. They are cannibalizing their best assets to hide the fact that the original elite corps is gone. In the dark, rainy streets of Tokyo, people are starting to notice the lack of naval celebrations. The victory was weeks ago, yet no ships have returned for a parade. The suspicion begins to take root, a quiet whisper in the markets and homes of the capital. Yamamoto is forced to attend a state dinner where he is toasted as a hero. He stands, raises his glass and forced to smile, but his eyes are dead. He feels like a fraud, a man being celebrated for a catastrophe he is forced to hide. The American island-hopping campaign begins in earnest. The High Command realizes that their invincible perimeter is being bypassed and crushed. The loss of the 4 carriers at Midway was the catalyst for this entire shift in momentum. An admiral sits in his office and contemplates ritual suicide, seppuku, to atone for the loss of the fleet. He is talked out of it by his colleagues, not out of mercy but because they need his experience to keep the facade of the Navy running. The first high-altitude reconnaissance photos of the American fleet show an endless sea of ships. The Japanese intelligence officers who see these photos realize the war is no longer about bravery or spirit. It is about steel and oil, and they are running out of both. Yamamoto moves his headquarters to Truk Atoll, closer to the front lines. He wants to be away from the politics of Tokyo and back with his men. The tropical heat and the constant threat of air attack provide a grim backdrop to his final months of command. The Navy High Command holds a silent review of the fleet. No ships are present. It is a tabletop exercise where they mourn the loss of the carriers in the only way they are allowed, through strategic silence and lowered heads. A young sailor who survived the Kaga returns home on a secret leave. He sees the propaganda posters and feels a surge of rage. He wants to scream the truth at the people in the street, but he knows the Kenpitai military police are watching his every move. The decisive battle doctrine is officially revised in secret documents. The goal is no longer to destroy the American fleet, but to make the cost of their victory so high they will negotiate. It is a transition from an offensive to a suicidal defensive posture. Yamamoto's flight schedule is finalized for his inspection tour of the Solomons. He knows the risks, but he refuses to change his plans. He boards the bomber with a sense of relief, as if he is finally heading toward a resolution he has been waiting for since Midway. Back in Tokyo, the Naval Ministry is a hive of frantic activity as the first reports of the Yamamoto interception arrive. The High Command realizes their last great leader is gone, and with him the last shred of hope for a favorable peace. The secret of the 4 lost carriers is finally integrated into the highest levels of the Army Command. The two branches realize they are both sinking, but instead of helping each other, they continue to fight over the remaining resources of the failing state. Years later, the sunken wrecks of the Akagi and Kaga are found on the ocean floor. The twisted metal is a testament to the violence of that June morning, a silent witness to a truth that was buried under layers of propaganda for decades. The final image of the war room shows the strategy table covered in dust. The carriers were never replaced, and the wooden blocks representing them were never taken out of the drawer. The room is empty, the empire it served now a memory of fire and hubris. The sun sets over the Pacific, the water turning the color of blood. The ocean remains indifferent to the empires that rise and fall on its surface, keeping the secrets of the 4 lost carriers locked in its cold, dark depths forever.